Good evening, friends. Welcome to the Hidden Treasures Jewish Heirlooms Roadshow. And thanks to all of you that have sent in pictures of your heirlooms. We just saw some of them. Don't worry if you missed the slideshow. We will be playing these again later at the end. I'm Marie van der Zyl, President of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. We're so proud to be leading on Hidden Treasures, and it's a project that celebrates Jewish archives in Britain and tells the story of the Jews in this country. Nearly 50 archives are involved in this project from all over the UK, and we've been showcasing these treasures on social media and at our events. But this evening, we are featuring some of the treasures people have in their own homes. It prompted me to look at my own Jewish heirlooms. Amongst them was a small card from the Central British Fund, which records the arrival in Britain of my grandfather on the Kinder transport, Max Lustman. This was in February 1939. It's the only document we have from that time. It's a truly British Jewish heirloom. At this Jewish Heirlooms Roadshow, we'll be in the capable hands of our very own Fiona Bruce, our Chief Executive, Gillian Merron. So over to you, Gillian.
Quite an introduction, Marie, and thank you. I'm so pleased to welcome our guests today and to welcome you all, everyone who's watching this evening. Don't forget to let us know where you're watching from by using the chat function, which you can also use to ask any questions. So, as you know, this evening we've got three fascinating double acts. Someone who is bringing their Jewish heirlooms to us, and an expert who's here to talk about them. And we'll be exploring the world. We're going to be going to Australia, we're going to be going to Scotland and to Malaya. So we're delighted to welcome broadcaster Nick Ross, whose father was Hans Rosenblut and was one of the people sent on the Dunera, a British ship which transported thousands of so-called enemy aliens to Australia during the Second World War. And Nick's going to be bringing some astonishing items from his father's time in Hay Camp 7. And he'll be talking with Dr. Rachel Pistol of King's College London, whose book, Internment During the Second World War, is a must-read for anyone who is interested in internment. Secondly, we've got one of the board's very own deputies, Andrew Lee, from the Jewish residential care homes of Hammerson Nightingale. We're very grateful to Andrew for taking time out at this, which is obviously a very busy time, to join us this evening. And Andrew will be talking about his family's 19th century mole book, or Circumcision Register. And he'll be talking with David Jacobs, who's a well-known Jewish community historian with his own impressive personal Jewish archive. David is, of course, a past chair of the Jewish Historical Society and is the current president of the Jewish Genealogical Society of Great Britain, as well as being the founder of the Museum of the Jewish East End at the Sternberg Centre, which was established in 1983. And thirdly, we have Joel Salmon, who used to work with us at the Board of Deputies. And Joel has brought the prayer book issued to Jewish members of Her Majesty's Forces and the medals awarded to his grandfather, Tony Friedman, who did his national service in the Malayan emergency in the 1950s. Joel is going to be talking to Martin Sugarman, the archivist of the Association of Jewish Ex-Servicemen, AJEX, and the former deputy curator of the Jewish Military Museum. And of course, we also know that Martin has written widely on Jewish military history. So as I said, please do share your comments and your questions via the chat. We're in for a real treat this evening. As you can tell, we've really got a rich collection, not just of memorabilia, heirlooms and people, but also content, countries and interest. So let me start by going over to you, Nick and Rachel. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Gillian, and it's great to be here this evening. So Nick, I thought it'd be good if you could tell people a little bit about your father. Let me just pull up a picture of him.
Well, while you do that, well, there he is. This is roughly the age he would have been when he was interned. And actually, Rachel, I mean, there's an irony to this, because in 1971, I was a reporter in Northern Ireland. I was involved in the civil rights movement. And the British government introduced internment then. And it was immoral, it was counterproductive, it was brutal. I had no idea that my father had been interned. It wasn't until after he died in 1990 that I really got to grips with what had happened to him in that period. Essentially, born in Berlin, his father was a leading Zionist, a close friend of David Ben-Gurion's. My father had actually come to England as a child because my grandfather, his father, was a Zionist representative of the League of Nations in London. But he'd gone back to Berlin, and then when in 1933, as soon as Hitler was elected, my grandmother, rather perspicacious woman, sent him to the railway station to get tickets for London. And he came to London. His father, meanwhile, had gone to Palestine to help found the state of Israel, as it became. So Hans came here with lots of different names, Rachel. He was known as Hans in Germany. He anglicized to John here. Most of the family knew him as Carol. So there's a whole cacophony of different names. And there he was, becoming a student, went to school where he met my mum, became engaged, and everything going fine till the war broke out. He was at LSE. They were then evacuated to Cambridge University. And then internment came.
Yes, indeed, and I think it's important to note that it was quite usual for former internees to not really talk about their experiences to their family, and I think many people are only learning about what happened to their fathers and grandfathers, sort of, in more recent years. And it's interesting that you should mention that he was a student at the LSE who was studying in Cambridge, where all the students from LSE were evacuated to. Because remarkably, sort of having looked into your father's story, had he not, had he been in Cambridge on the day when all of the other students were interned, he most likely would have ended up in Canada. Whereas, in fact, of course, we know that he was on the Dunera. And just to give a little bit of background, just in case anybody who's watching isn't familiar with the Dunera, as we were talking about this whole idea of internment and so-called enemy aliens, once Britain was at war with Germany and Austria, and then later on Italy, anybody who held citizenship from those countries became automatically an enemy alien. And the British did try not to intern all of them because they were aware that there were many Jewish refugees who were actually very much committed to fighting the Nazis. But after the fall of France and the Low Countries in May 1940, there was a big fear that Britain was going to be invaded, and that there could be the potential of a fifth column of these enemy aliens. And so the British government decided the best thing to do would be to lock everybody up and then figure out who were the allies that they could then release again. And as part of this, there were fears that the Isle of Man, which is where the sort of semi-permanent camps were set up, after an individual was arrested, they were sent to a variety of smaller camps on the mainland before being shipped across to the Isle of Man. And so your father spent a couple of weeks in Lingfield Racecourse before heading up to Liverpool, where he thought he was going to the Isle of Man, and in fact ended up on this ship, the Dunera, as the British government had asked Canada and Australia to take on some of these potentially dangerous enemy aliens in order to make sure that there was enough space to hold them on. So that's how your father ended up on the Dunera with his cousin.
It became quite notorious. I mean, there are books, and there was a full-length feature film about the Dunera. Of course, everybody's forgotten it now, but it was, I mean, just an extraordinary, brutal experience for the 2,000 on board. I think it's right, Rachel, you correct me if I'm wrong, that the Daily Mail had a headline saying, "Lock them all up," or "Lock the lot of them up," or something like that. And passions were running quite high. And when they got on board, I mean, they were beaten with rifle butts. They were treated as though they were Nazis themselves. And conditions were terrible, absolutely appalling on board.
That's completely right. And the Dunera is by far the worst in terms of conditions. And so, I mean, this transport abroad scheme started at the end of June and ran to the Dunera was the last ship to sail on the 10th of July 1940. But as you're saying, tensions are running very high, and certainly the right-wing press were saying all sorts of things about these enemy aliens who were they claimed that they were doing sabotage and all sorts of other things. Now, the original part of the confusion that goes on with the Dunera is the British government's original plan was to send only the most dangerous, so prisoners of war and merchant seamen and self-professed Nazis, and they actually ran out of those, and they started putting refugees on. And some of the most popular refugees that they chose, they were all men who were transported abroad, were the younger single males, as they felt it would be better to send them out of the country.
But of course, the big problem was not the policy. The big problem was the troops on board, who were, I think one of the papers subsequently said, scum. I mean, years later, or I think 2 years later, they were court-martialed and all sorts of things happened. But at the time, these 2,000 people just disappeared off the face of the earth. They were locked down below decks for all but a few minutes every day in stinking, appalling circumstances. All their baggage was taken away, rifled through, everything was stolen, their luggage was thrown overboard. I mean, it was just an appalling experience for them.
It was. It's certainly an event that does not reflect well on the military at all who was involved, because as you're right, as they were boarding, the refugees were losing anything of value, watches, wedding rings, anything made out of any precious metals, I mean, even visa papers and all sorts of other things were confiscated. The ship was surrounded with barbed wire. There was very little air that could come down to the lower parts of the ship where your father was.
And of course, when they arrived in Australia, they had no idea where they were being sent. And incidentally, they were torpedoed on the way. The torpedo didn't go off, but several of the internees had been on the Arandora Star, which had set off a week earlier, which had been torpedoed with massive loss of life. With, of course, so many of the prisoners were locked downstairs below decks when the ship sank. They were taken straight back to Liverpool, put straight on the next ship. I mean, they must have been terrified at the next torpedo. But I was going to say, when it arrived in Australia, of course, the 2000 had no idea how they were going to be received, that whether it was going to be as brutal there. What they had not realized is that everybody back in Britain had been campaigning like crazy, and the Australians had got wind that something wasn't right, and they actually didn't get a bad reception at all.
No, not at all. I mean, partway through the voyage, because it was incredibly hot on the ship as they were travelling through the tropics, they realised that they were not headed to Canada, as some of them had suspected, and they were actually on the way to Australia. And when they arrived in Australia, they were quite a motley crew, and the Australian guards were very quick to realise that they hadn't been sent the Nazi prisoners that they expected. So actually, in terms of how they they were appallingly treated on the Dunera, but when they landed in Australia, that's when things started to look up a little bit. Now, they still had very long train journeys to get through, but I think, as many of the internees noted, the food was very much better in Australia than it had been anywhere else. And this brings me nicely onto a little plan that your father drew of the camp that he was first sent to, which is Hay, New South Wales, and he was in camp number 7.
I said to an Australian who lived near there that Hay was in the middle of nowhere, which it is. They were terribly upset at this. Not the middle of nowhere; it's the centre of the universe. But I mean, it is pretty remote where they sent them.
It is pretty remote and subject to various certain climactic issues such as dust storms and very, very strong light. But they were certainly given quite a lot of freedom to run their own affairs and quite a lot of autonomy within the camp. And your father stayed in Hut 26.
And I wish I had this here, Rachel, because you've seen this in the flesh. The Migration Museum in Lewisham has got it's a stunning exhibition at the moment. Of course, you can't go there because everything's shut, which is such a shame. It's called Departures. And there's this whole section about enforced departures. When people think of migration in this country, they so often think of immigration. And of course, we've had massive amounts of migration, most of it voluntary, some to Australia, not. And of course, this lot, including my father, were the last people to be transported as prisoners to Australia. Australians think that transportation started a long time, finished a long time before that. Yeah. But what happens with this is it's wonderful. It's 3D, and the roof can come off. It's all made of paper. The roof can come off, and you can see all the bunks inside. The walls will collapse down. It's a fabulous piece of art.
It is really beautiful, and I've never seen anything quite like it. So I would definitely recommend, after lockdown, I would highly recommend to people that they go to the Migration Museum and have a look at some of these exhibits, as it really gives a feel for how life was in camp. Yeah.
Somebody just asked whether it was like that in Canada, and of course, I suspect the camps were fairly similar. The Australian guards were, I mean, quite friendly with the internees. They couldn't really understand why the internees were there. It was just the journey on the Dunera which happened to be so particularly appalling.
That was what was awful. Now in Canada, it was actually very, very different, because the guards never really got the guards and the Canadian government never got past the idea that they'd been sent prisoners of war.
Oh, really?
So actually, yes, they were not treated nearly as generously as in Australia, and the camps were not as well provided for in many respects.
I don't think we've got any pictures here of the latrines, which were pretty crude, but there is a story that one of the guards wanted to go to one of the latrines. The guards' ones were rather better. He left his gun outside with one of the internees. And I think that was fairly typical. There was a sense that, what on earth are these guys doing here?
Yeah, very, very much so, in terms of that. And I think it's, Hut 26, where your father was, sort of, there were a lot of quite influential people in the camp. I mean, not least your father, who was he was his hut captain of Hut 26, as well as being the camp postmaster in Hay Camp 7, as well as the camp secretary, which is why he has so many wonderful.
Rachel, that account, I've got this. Yeah. I mean, everything we've discovered about my dad actually comes from this sort of great case here, and lots and lots of documents. The fact he was secretary of the camp and post office, head of the post office, explains so much of what's in here. All the letters to the government, all the letters to the Australian government, and all the attempts to get people out, and the correspondence saying, well, if you join the army, then we might find you a ship home, all this sort of stuff. It's all in here.
Absolutely. And I mean, we could talk for hours about your father's wonderful collection. One thing that sort of jumps out that's also in the Migration Museum, I believe, this is one of the birthday cards that your father's hut mates made for him, which is a wonderful little summary of internment, I think. And the camp. Sorry, I was going to say
the Roebucks, and you can see the picture. It's brilliant, actually, because if you saw a picture of my father with his glasses on, and I think he had a little moustache, and that they've turned him into the Roebuck, and then there's the De Niro in the background. It's a great little poem, this.
It is wonderful, isn't it? So sort of just enlarged it so that people can read it, and it's so true. I mean, because you also had in that store, you had the leader of the camp, Andrew Eppenstein, and your father's cousin was in there, and there was the stores manager, Rudy Moore, the bank clerk, Carl Lowenberg, and many other people as well. And this is the second half of the poem. So clearly there's your father delivering the mail and sorting it out. Yeah. And the huge queues. I mean, mail was such an important thing. I mean, the post, it was the only way you could have any communication with any of your loved ones. And of course, because they were in Australia, it took so much longer to get post, and it had to pass through the censors as well. So it's quite amazing that you still have many of your father's letters.
Some of them are quite funny, Rachel, because when they censored them, what they did is took a pair of scissors or a razor blade and cut out, because paper was so scarce, everything's written on the back. So as soon as you censor something on one side of the page, you rip it out from the back as well, making it completely unreadable.
It's very true. And I think a lot of the internees, realising that some of their messages were being censored, they did take to copying out all of their letters and numbering them. It was very important that they numbered them so that they could tell actually which of their letters had been received by their loved ones, because your father was sending a lot of post to his mother and also to his fiancée, Joy, who became your mother.
Who was writing, by the looks of it, almost every day to MPs or to somebody or other, trying to get them out.
And we just have the front of this card that was designed by his hutmates. So again, there's your father as the postmaster with his moustache, which your mother wrote and said, I've just seen a picture when somebody was released from internment before he was. She said, I've seen a picture of what you look like with the moustache, and you're going to have to remove it before you come back. But we can also see, I mean, this led me to actually find something else that isn't part of your collection. And this is held at the Jewish Museum in Australia. We're not entirely sure exactly why, but it's part of the estate of W. Titchauer, who drew this. And this is, hold on a sec, I've accidentally gone too far. Hold on, let's go back. And this is another birthday card, which we realised based on the Roebucks and the images of your father with post. And there's your mother waving from England. And there's a terrapin down the bottom with this bag of cement. And actually, what's quite interesting is your father's cousin, who was also interned with him, he set up they brought some terrapins back from the local river, and they built them a little pond made from cement, and very tongue-in-cheek, because your father also wrote, he also used to write some of the camp news, and he wrote a news story in 1941 saying, "Worthy hut captain ruined by enterprising cousin. A broadside attack was made today on the purse of your hut captain by his cousin Rosenblut. A £112 bag of cement was waiting at the canteen for delivery to Hut Roebuck. It was needed there for the reconstruction of our pet swimming pool." And apparently these terrapins brought great joy. They were sort of unofficially the camp mascots.
What the thing that you showed, can we just go on to the next one?
Yes, that is exactly what we need to go on to.
This is, of course, the key thing for them. They were holding these things up wherever they could. When they arrived in Australia, they'd made these. I mean, of course, at the beginning, they weren't given any paper at all. But as soon as they did, they were trying to persuade everybody that they weren't Nazis, they were anti-Nazis.
Yeah, and the big thing about this note paper is that they were provided with this paper to write their letters, which would be sent for free. And they objected strongly to the fact that this was prisoner of war post. And it clearly said all over the envelope it was from prisoners of war. And they didn't obviously want to be associated with prisoners of war. Now, the practical reason why they were provided with prisoner of war note paper was because it was free. And it was free post. Eventually, they did manage to gain a concession where they were provided with different paper, which was still prisoner of war post, so free, but it didn't say as obviously prisoner of war, because they didn't want their loved ones receiving all of these pieces of post, and the neighbour and the postman thinking that, you know, gosh, they really were spies and saboteurs and things like that.
There is another irony to this, which is that my father, many of the internees stayed in Australia. Those that came back, many of them joined the Pioneer Corps, a regiment known as the King's Most Loyal Enemy Aliens. And he finished the war being sent out to Malaya. And the irony is he finished up in charge as a major of the British Army, in charge of a whole bunch of internees and prisoners of war. So that the prisoner had become the jailer by the end of the war.
Wow, I mean, it's really quite a remarkable story, and I'd love to talk about it more, but we must now hand over to the next set.
I want to thank Nick and Rachel. What a start to the evening, and as you said, Rachel, we could have stayed for hours talking about this, and I got a real sense, Nick, of how this has affected you to know this history, but also to share it with us. And I really thank you for it. And thank you, Rachel, for bringing it also to life, which means we can now move on to our friends, Andrew and David. So for our next treat, I hand over to you.
Hello, I'm Andrew Lee, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about an artifact that's come down through our family from much longer ago than the first pair. Can we have the first slide, please? No, we're going the wrong way. I think we want to go the opposite way. Next. Okay, thank you. So this artifact came down through my mother's family. The chap standing at the back is my grandfather, my mother's father, whose name was Alphonse Louis Nathan. He's the one in the beret, with his three brothers taken during the First World War. He was born in 1894 in Dundee. How he came by the name of Alphonse Louis Nathan, born in Dundee, I don't know, but that was his name. And my mother has traced her family roots on his side back to the 18th century. And we're going to be talking about an artifact that's come down through his side, on his mother's side. So we're now coming to the early 19th century. Can we have the next slide, please? To this gentleman, whose name was Moses Joel. Moses Joel was born in 1788 and passed away in 1863. He seems to have come from Bavaria, and he is my fourth or fifth great-grandfather. He looks very English, but as I say, he came from Germany. And he moved to Edinburgh, probably via London, sometime around 1819, 1820 or thereabouts. And when he's regarded as the first minister of the Edinburgh Jewish community. I don't think he had any kind of rabbinical qualifications, but he was a knowledgeable person and someone who was variously referred to as the reader, someone who could at least lead services. And the artifact we're now going to talk about is he was not only the reader, but he was also the mohel, the person who performed ritual circumcision. So if we can move on to the next slide. The book is written. This is the first page of the book, and it is that's the first page of the circumcision ceremony. So the book is bound both from the right and to the left. So on one side, it's all written on parchment, and it's very beautifully written, presumably with a quill pen and ink, etc., on parchment. The next slide, please. And this is the inscription. His name, Moshe Ben Yoel, is written there just above the line. And if you read the last line, a sort of bold script, says Yehoshua ben Shlomo, Joshua the son of Shlomo, who's the person who I think wrote the book for him. Next slide, please. So this is just a random page that I photocopied. The top of the page is the blessing over the wine, which is said during the circumcision ceremony, and it runs to about 6 or 7 pages in the book, plus all the laws and what you can do and what you can't do. The handwriting is very beautifully laid out, like a Sefer Torah. But if you go to the other side of the book, next slide, please. There is a record of everybody who he circumcised, and this is written on paper. So the book is bound with parchment on one side, and paper going the opposite way. And this presumably is his own handwriting. So the book starts in the first entry is 1830, and the last one, the 9th of December 1830. Maybe you can just make that one out. And the last one is the 6th of June, 1860. So it spans 30 years. And during that period, he circumcised 96 children. The Edinburgh Jewish community, to give some sense of numbers and size at the time, from documents that have been researched and are freely available on the web, it would seem that there was, according to a document of 1837, the reports from the commissioners, the religious, which is a House of Lords publication, religious institutions in Scotland. So in 1837, so it's about the time that he was there, there were 20 members, 20 families, which amounted to 106 or 110 individuals. And they did not produce very much in the way of income. So Moses Joel, the total income of the synagogue at the time was about £107, and of which £55 went to him per annum. To give some sense of what that means, he was getting a salary of about £5,600 by today's standard. So that's not very much money. And it even says in this record that because of that, he had to go and find other jobs. And part of that £55 was made up from additional voluntary contributions and marriage fees amounting to £7. All the members of the synagogue lived within 1 mile of where he was of the synagogue. And he was also the shochet, he was the baker, and he was the mohel as well. So just before I hand over to David, I'll just add the following things in terms of the names written in the book. They go from sort of very Jewish names. So there's an Israel Levy, a Henry Cohen, a Moses Levy, Joseph Friedlander, through to the quite sort of English names. There's a Michael Levenston, someone who rejoiced in the name of Lazarus, so not very imaginative parents there. And to two people, one called Adolf Solomons, another one called Adolf Levy. They obviously didn't know how unpopular that name was going to become 100 years later. So that's the information that I have about him and about the book. It's very difficult to read the handwriting there. I've tried and passed it on to other people, and no one's been able to decipher it. David, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Really interesting that we have such an item as a Moel book. There have been others made available through the generations. Probably another interesting book that we have in the records is the Portman Circumcision Register. That gives the dates of birth of most of the Jewish boys born in Portsmouth over a period of 45 years. But it also gives information about the causes of the split in the local community in 1766. It throws some light on Jews living in the counties of Hampshire, Sussex, Dorset, and part of Essex. It also gives the places of origin of the child's father and his occupation or calling. But there have been other circumcision registers provided for us by the Spanish and Portuguese Jewish congregation. We have the Circumcision Register of Isaac and Abram de Paber from 1715 to 1775. And they also provide us with a record of circumcisions from almost the very beginning of the Jewish community here in England after the resettlement in the 1650s. So that's available from the Spanish and Portuguese Jewish community and also through the Jewish Historical Society. Next slide, please. I have to admit, ladies and gentlemen, members of the Genealogical Society, Historical Society, family and friends, that this was found in my parents' garage in 1982, unframed. It was given to my great-grandmother, Mrs. Isaac Asher Isaacs, Annie Isaacs, by the Manchester Jewish Ladies Visiting Association. The main purpose of the Ladies Visiting Association was not to relieve poverty, somewhat surprisingly, and material help is granted only in the cases of illness. I'm quoting from their 1934 report. Its real purpose being to inculcate a high standard of hygiene amongst the people visited and to teach wherever possible such habits as may help to prevent the beginning of disease. Some of the language sounds quite familiar today. My great-grandmother gave birth to my grandmother, who was a suffragette in Manchester, one of the few Jewish suffragettes in Manchester. We are very proud of her activities. Next slide, please. Ladies and gentlemen, a sort of cri de coeur from me. If you are aware of a synagogue closing, please make sure that you photograph plaques such as this, rather than them be sawn in half, because the other half of this plaque was used to board up the windows of the East London Synagogue in Rectory Square. I'm known for some of my rescuing of such plaques. It now sits in one of our storage cases here in our block of flats. Sadly, I only know half the information because, as I said, the other half appeared to use as the boarding up of the synagogue after its closure. Next slide, please. And in another storage cage in our block is this wooden memorial board somewhat later from the Great Garden Street Synagogue in East London, in Whitechapel. I found this in a builder's yard amongst a whole load of boards such as this that had been removed by the builder when that synagogue closed. Sadly, I've not been able to identify these people, but the board is available to any of the descendants of these people. And really, ladies and gentlemen, what I want to say now is the importance of ensuring that records are kept safely. One of my mentors, Professor Bill Williams of Manchester, learnt to his horror that the records of the Higher Broughton Synagogue in Duncan Street, Manchester, were buried when the synagogue was demolished. And we find as genealogists and historians who are trying to ensure that plaques and information is properly recorded and maintained in proper facilities. As I said, I'm somewhat of a rescuer, probably just as Andrew is. Andrew has been very fortunate that his family actually handed down this information, and I hope that you will think carefully. I would hope that the hidden Jewish heirlooms drop the word hidden, that there should be a proper facility for Jewish heirlooms. We have a Jewish museum. As you heard, I started a small Jewish museum reflecting the life of the East End. But that this work should continue and that you should actively concern yourself with preserving these records, either within your family or donating them, as I have. I've donated about 1,000 records to the London Metropolitan Archive. And just briefly to mention also that I donated the synagogue archives, of which Joel and I are members, to the London Borough of Barnet. All that information can be available through Dawn at the board, and she will feed us with requests if you are unsure what to do with them. But please make sure, if you are the recipient of certainly a community record, that it is kept safely for future generations and future researchers.
Thank you very much for that very timely reminder, David, of how we can preserve our heritage. And I would just endorse, if anyone's got any questions, to contact Dawn Waterman at the Board of Deputies, who will be happy to advise. I'd like to thank Andrew and David for taking us on a fascinating tour of Edinburgh, and indeed a different century. And now we have a chance to cross the world, and we're going to be going to Malaya, and we're going to be talking about Jews in the armed forces. So with that, I say over to Joel and over to Martin.
Hello. Thanks very much, Gillian. So my name's Joel Salmon, and today I'm presenting my grandpa's prayer book, which he took with him during his national service in the Malayan emergency in the mid-1950s. So he was about 19 at the time. And his mum had managed to get their doctor, to provide a note to say that he was ineligible for national service to sort of, prevent him from going. But he just met my grandma, and that's my grandpa there on the right of the picture. That was when they were in Malaya. So when he was called up for national service, he just sent my grandma, whose father, who was my great-grandfather, Alan Burke, had fought during World War II in the Navy and had then gone on to fight in Israel's War of Independence in 1948. So that was quite an example to follow. So I think Grandpa wanted to win my grandma's heart. So he decided to go on national service. So when he signed up, they weren't told where they were going. They were put on a boat. They boarded the ship, and after a few weeks, ended up in Malaya. And I just think it's quite incredible to sort of do that, having never been abroad before, boarding a ship, and you can just imagine at that age and at that time, the early 1950s, it's like no place that he'd ever been before in his life. He saw out his service. It was about 2 years at the time, national service. But one of my favorite stories about him is that he was on leave in Singapore, and someone came into the camp and asked, "Is anyone here Jewish?" And of course, usually when someone asks that, sort of puts your hairs go up on the back of your neck. But it was to see if anyone was Jewish and wanted to go to a Seder for Passover, because it was Passover at the time. So he put his hand up and he went to this Seder, and there are a few expats there, and it's being hosted by this Jewish family who lived in Singapore. And Grandpa's always loved singing. So when he was there, he sung one of the songs that his father had taught him, Uv Makalot, it's called. And we still sing it actually when we have our Seders at home during Pesach. So he sung it in front of this crowd during the Seder, and everyone found it very moving. Fast forward 50 years, and he's singing in the choir in Wimbledon synagogue one Shabbat. And a man comes up to him and says, I was at a Passover Seder in Singapore many years ago. Were you by any chance that boy who sung that song? So such coincidence and such a nice connection at the end. I can't imagine how it must have been going from Manchester in the 1950s to the other side of the world, having never been abroad. So I brought this prayer book with to sort of show what kind of things he would have been looking at, and it's got some quite interesting bits in it. One being prayer that you say before going to war, going on a battle. So I'll just bring that up over here. Some quite interesting text. It's not the sort of thing you these days see in your prayer book if you ever do go to synagogue or use it in other parts of your life whenever you go to a service. I thought that the text and the language was very interesting, and maybe Martin, in a second you can talk a little bit more about this kind of prayer book and when Jews in the UK would have used it when they've gone to war. I also just bring up these are the medals that he has. And it'd be really interesting, Martin, to hear sort of a bit more explanation about what they mean and what they represent. And obviously there's different medals that you get for serving in different conflicts and in different wars and different parts of service, depending on which of the forces that you're in. So every year we march together on the Ajax parade. That was us last year. I'm wearing the medals of my great grandpa, who I mentioned previously, and I march with him each year in remembrance, really, of all the Jewish men and women who served in the UK Armed Forces. But I'd love, Martin, to hear a little bit more about the prayer book, about some of those medals and other memorabilia about that time.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Joel. That was lovely. The prayer book you talk about is the one which I've got a copy here in my own collection. They were published, first of all, in the First World War. Some were in paperback, and they were deliberately this size so they could slip into the blouse pocket of the service uniform. And yes, they had these special prayers in, because of course these were special circumstances before going into a battle, prayers for the wounded, prayers for the dying, and so on. We weren't the only ones doing this. The Americans published their own prayer books. I bought some here to show you, in various shapes and sizes. But the other one that the British Jewish chaplains gave to the soldiers was this one, the Book of Jewish Thoughts. This was also quite a popular publication among the public, and it's basically themes of topics that you could read about. There's one on time and eternity, there's one on the Jewish year, and they were excerpts from writings by scholars and historians over the years, which read in the evening, say, when you were in your tent or serving abroad, would bring back some, memories of your people and your home. In terms of what we collect at the Jewish Military Museum, my message is the same as that of David. We collect these prayer books. Lots of people have sent them to us, and one among the more valuable ones is, and this one came in the post to me yesterday, this one I held up. It's actually full of writing that the soldier has written about where he's been serving. So it's actually a historical document. It begins in Birmingham when he was called up, and it goes right the way through. So when he ends up in the fighting in Italy, and he names all the camps he was in, and the dates. And this is even more detail than you'd get on his actual record. You can right away to the government records office for the army, in this case. You can also do this for the Navy and Air Force, and actually purchase your relative's full record. It costs £30. They won't be in the public domain probably for another 10 years because they are waiting for almost 100 years to pass. The First World War ones are available on Ancestry and at the National Archives that survive. Only 40% survive. But the World War II ones, you can as a family write for the records of your own family and get them, although you have to pay the fee. And they will show all that kind of detail about where they served, and you can get a much better picture, because then you can go to the war diary of the units that he was in and find out actually where he was even when they were abroad. We also have prayer books which have the soldier's name written inside them, like the one you've got. Those are more valuable. We like to keep those because they actually give a face to the book. And we also have some, as I've said, that have records in like that. Some have got stamps on. We have one very unusual one, which was given to us by Jack Kaplan, who was a prisoner of the Japanese. And it was an American pocket prayer book, very much like this one, which I'm holding up. But instead of just having someone's name in it, along the rim of the prayer book was in Japanese saying that it had been passed by the censor, and on this side it was stamped passed by the Japanese censor in English. Jack couldn't remember where he got it from, but he used it throughout his time as a prisoner, and they had services in the camps where he was. And this was another function of the prayer book. If you were taken prisoner, the Jewish lads used to hold services, and they could actually use the prayer book as a prompt, because of course otherwise they had to remember everything off by heart. In case of some of the Japanese camps, that's exactly what they did. They used to remember prayers, particularly at Yom Kippur, by heart. And we have in the museum the handwritten prayer of Kol Nidre, written by David Arkush, the late David Arkush, when he led services in Changi prison when he was a prisoner of the Japanese. So the ones that don't have anything written in them, we've given to other museums, because you'd be amazed how little people know about Jewish servicemen and women in the two world wars. And when I was researching the book on the fire brigade, using the fire brigade at the Guildhall Library, they had an exhibition of prayer books in our daily life. And they did not have a Jewish prayer book from the Second World War. So the next visit, I brought it along, and they were astonished. They did not know such a thing even existed. So we presented it to them. I took it on behalf of Ajax, and it's now in their collection. Now you said something about the medals. The medal on the right-hand side is the Malaya General Service Medal. The British give medals at 3 levels. There are bravery awards, campaign stars, and the General Service Medal. And in the case of your relative, he was in Cyprus, in Malaya, so it says very clearly Malaya on the little metal tag. The color of the ribbons, there's no rhyme or reason behind the ribbon on that particular one. I'll come back to that in a moment. But there are others. There was one for Cyprus, one for Kenya. The Korean War medal was a completely separate one. The Kenya medal was separate, but the bar was given for Cyprus and Malaya. And there's also the General Service Medal for other conflicts, for South Arabia, for Java and Sumatra, wherever British forces were. And we have examples of many of them in the museum. The other one is not a formal medal. That is a National Service Medal that you actually purchased, because after the National Service finished in '62, the National Servicemen and women were quite concerned that they weren't being recognized with the issue of a medal. So with the British Legion, they got together and they had a commemorative medal produced, and all National Servicemen could buy it and wear it on parades, whether it was in the Ajax parade or the national parade for the country the week before in Whitehall. The ribbons of various medals vary in color. I'm just going to hold up a framed version of the one that I've got of my uncle, who did not have any children, so he bequeathed these all to me. And you can see how I've had it framed. It's quite expensive, but it's the best way of preserving them. And
yeah, it looks great.
Yeah, it is. And we've got the photograph of him. He was in the Desert Rats, and then him with me, because I was in the Israeli army for a while, and we went on one or two of the marches together. And there's his sweetheart's handkerchief he gave to his wife, his D-Day commemorative medal, his cap badge, and his Dunkirk commemoration, because he was in all of these campaigns. But you'll notice the medal ribbons are different colors. And the first one, the 3945 star, you can look up on the internet when you got that, what it was eligible for. You had to have been either killed, prisoner, or served abroad. And the blue is for the Navy, the red is for the Army, and the light blue for the Air Force. The one next to it is the Africa Star, and the yellow is for the sand of the desert. The two blue vertical lines are for the Mediterranean Sea, and the red, so they say, for the blood that was spilt. And the last two that he had, there's the Italy Star, which is the Italian flag colours, and the France and Germany Star, the colours for France and Britain. And the little oak leaf here, he was mentioned in dispatches for bravery in Italy. That was my Uncle Jack Cruier. I actually encourage people to do one of two things with their medals. It's very important. You should get them framed with a photograph, and the way I've done it, and keep them and hand them down in the family. If you don't want to do that, we will take them and look after them, because like David was saying with the museums he's been associated with, and I helped the late Henry Morris set up the proper Jewish military museum, which was in Hendon and is now in Camden with the Jewish Museum. We had to amalgamate. We will keep this stuff for posterity, and I appeal to everybody watching this program, tell all your friends and family, if you've got material like this, do not get rid of it, do not throw it away, do not sell it. I've heard some terrible stories of medals that have been sold. Give them to us. We will treasure them at Ajax for posterity. Tell us your stories, type them out, send them to me. Most people know how to contact me through Ajax. I'm happy to deal with phone calls, emails, anything. And let us have this stuff, or keep it safely in the family, but put it in a presentable fashion so that it can be passed through the generations. So lovely stuff, Joel. Really nice to see that you care. Not all young people do. And I hope everybody will be copycats and do the same.
Absolutely. Thanks, Martin.
Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Joel and Martin, for that. And we could see how much the medals and the prayer books mean to both of you. And I'm sure we all heard what you said, Martin, about how we should all look after things that we might have in our care, for all the very many reasons illustrated by you and Joel. So we're coming towards the end, which means we do have a few minutes for each of our dynamic duos for any other comments that they'd like to make. So I'm going to go first of all to Nick and to Rachel. Are there any, I'm sure there are, final reflections, feelings, words of advice for us that you've got? Over to you, Nick and Rachel.
Oh, I did notice that there was a comment earlier where someone was saying how they had been on the Dunera, that one of their relatives had been on the Dunera and then gone to Tatura camp. And that was actually a series of lots of different camps. They housed all sorts of anti-Nazis, pro-Nazis, and other refugees from other parts of the world in all sorts of different camps. So they wouldn't, most of the refugees they were in Hay camp 7 or 8 and then moved on to one of the Tatura camps and then moved on to other camps. For example, Nick's father went from Hay camp 7 to Tatura camp 4 and then on to Loveday camp, which is where they had people who were going to go back to England to join the Pioneer Corps and join the British Army. But adding on to some of the comments from earlier, I just wanted to say, if anybody's got any information about, anything that sort of has been held on in their family, you know, you can always get in touch with myself or with some of the other institutions in this country who'd love to talk to you about the papers that you have.
Thanks, Rachel. Nick, final words of wisdom?
Thank you. Well, I just thought it might be worth saying something about reconciliation, because after my father's really appalling treatment at the hands of the troops on the Dunera, he never held it against, and the fact that he was interned in the first place, and obviously desperately, one of the reasons he didn't talk about it, I'm sure, it's humiliating to have been a prisoner. But he never, ever held it against the British. He was always patriotic and very pro-British. He refused to go to Germany, ever, until very, very late in life, when my mother eventually persuaded him that he should go back, because the school friends had got in touch again and again, tried to get him to go back. Once he did go back the first time, of course, he got on famously with his school friends, and then went back almost every year until his death. And indeed, when I went with my wife and my children to see where he was born and my grandfather was born, we were welcomed like almost sort of long lost relatives by people who lived there. So much so that I took out German citizenship. I know a lot of people found it, they couldn't possibly do that. But I think in the sense of my father's feeling of reconciliation, I think that's an important lesson to come out of this, that you can harbor hatred and anger about what happened, or you can say, let's move on. And I think that is one lesson that should come out of this.
Thanks very much, Nick. And that's a very powerful lesson for us all, which shows that, you know, heirlooms, memorabilia, treasures aren't something of the past. They teach us so much for now. And so I'm going to turn now to Andrew and to David to ask for any final reflections, feelings and thoughts from you.
David?
Thank you. Thanks, Andrew. And thanks, Gillian. I just want to bring up the point that this year will mark the 50th anniversary of my oral histories with my own grandparents, where I learned that my grandmother was a suffragette. I learned about anti-Semitism in the First World War, and I subsequently interviewed the father of the children that I used to babysit, where I learned about the smells of the East End, as the interviewee told me how he walked to school taking a shortcut through somebody's shop, and he could smell the freshness of the produce in the shop. So I would encourage you very much to undertake oral histories with your elderly relatives, grandparents. I'm now a grandparent myself, and I'm being interviewed. It's a strange experience, the role reversal there. But oral history plays a very important part in the collection of people's histories and personal histories. The Jewish Museum has my collection of oral histories. I interviewed all the remaining Jews in Merthyr Tydfil in 1977. The Welsh Folklore Museum have got those interviews. I interviewed the coroner for Merthyr Tydfil at that time, who conducted the inquest in Aberfan. These are important memories. Many of these people would not have written a memoir. They're not written in books on the whole, although we're increasingly doing that today. And oral history complements the written histories that have been compiled over the generations. And of course, it is in Jewish tradition to have both written and oral histories running in parallel, from which we can learn from both. So
thank you, David. Thank you. And Andrew?
Unfortunately, it's obviously far too late to interview Moses Joel. He's long gone. And unfortunately, I also did not have the opportunity to meet my grandfather, who passed away before I was born, and after whom I was named. But I am the deputy for Nightingale Hammerson, and working at both at Nightingale and at Hammerson House, just like to echo what David said. What brought me into this work, apart from sort of making sure that older members of the community receive the care that they need, but it's listening to people's life stories and is fascinating. and I'm not going to go on and list all the sorts of people I've spoken to during the course of my professional life, but someone turns up, a little old lady from wherever, and she has the most amazing stories. And again, sometimes it can never be too soon. We live in an era where people are living longer and longer, but dementia as well is also taking hold. People living with dementia, and before short-term memory goes, but long-term memory remains, and people will go back and remember things way back. And on a personal level, I also undertook an oral interview with my grandmother on my other side of my family, who was born in 1906, and it's one of the most precious tapes that I have, her reflecting on life in the East End at the beginning of the 20th century.
Very true, Andrew, and a reminder to us all, it's actually a privilege to be conducting these interviews and gathering information to pass on. So it's very good you remind us of that. So the final words go, of course, to Joel and to Martin.
Well, I'd echo the point about the oral history and in really interviewing your relatives and friends. I did the same with my grandparents, which is partly why I've got the kind of story that goes behind this prayer book. The one tip I'd give, though, would be interview them separately, because they both had quite different versions of history, which was quite interesting and entertaining to hear about.
Martin.
I echo everything that David and Joel have said. I'm very fortunate because although I'm 73, when I was in my 30s, I interviewed all of my uncles about their war stories and all of the wives who went through the Blitz. And it's all on tape, and I typed it up for my own grandchildren. And it's a great testimony. I'm very fortunate to have just thought about doing it. Many people didn't. And interviewing them like that is very, very important. I think it's absolutely right. I'd like to add one thing about medals. A lot of people did not claim their medals. The medals were sent out automatically, and if you had moved house, then you didn't get them. And you can still claim them. They're free. If you can prove who you are for your grandparents who've passed on, you can still get them for free. And if need be, you can buy some from dealers because they're not engraved, except for some of the awards. And if you have a relative who was in the civilian services, my book about the firemen and so on, and the people who served in those important war services, you can still get the defense medal for them. That's the one with the green ribbon. And so long as you send the proof, these things are still obtainable, and you can then keep them and treasure them.
Thank you for that advice, Martin. And it now falls to me to thank our panelists. I did say we were in for a treat, and we certainly got that. I actually found so much of what you all said to be very moving, and I'm sure that our audience felt the same way. But you've also taught us and reminded us of the value of history. It's a living history, and it's something that sustains us currently. And so I want to thank, as I say, all of our panelists for your time, but also for opening the stores, opening your minds, opening the thoughts, and sharing that with us. I'd like to thank our audience for being with us tonight. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. I'm sure you have. And I'd also like to thank our media partners, who are the Jewish Chronicle. Your support continues to be so valued by us. And before we go, I'd like to ask Dawn Waterman, who leads our Hidden Treasures project at the Board of Deputies of British Jews, to say a few closing words. Over to you, Dawn.
Thank you, Gillian. What a terrific evening. At the Board of Deputies, we've been so delighted with the response to Hidden Treasures and to the 50 or so archives we showcase. Archives that tell the story of Jews in Britain, just like the ones we've heard this evening. I just want to say, if you have a Jewish heirloom at home that you'd like to share, do please send us a picture and tell us the story behind the photo. send it to celebratingjewisharchives.org and follow us on social media at See the Treasures. We'd really love to hear from you. To finish tonight, here's a chance to have another look at some of the Jewish heirlooms that we've already received. Good evening, and thank you very much for watching.